Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're ready. Yes, we're live. Okay, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our fourth event of the term. We've got the pleasure of being joined by Professor Noam Chomsky, who's currently Laureate Professor of Linguistics at the University of Arizona and Emeritus Professor of Linguistics at MIT. He's the author of over 100 books, including Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, Who Rules the World, and Profit Over People, Neoliberalism and the Global Order. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question before the event. We'll try and incorporate them throughout the session. So first of all, Noam, you've lived through 16 presidents throughout your lifetime. How serious has the Trump presidency been for one, US power in the world, and two, climate stability?
With regard to US power in the world, it remains overwhelming. Trump has harmed it to some extent, but I don't think that enhancing US power is a positive thing. The world has suffered plenty from that. What Trump has done is something else. There's a reason why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists doomsday clock has moved towards midnight every year that Trump has been in office. And last January, in fact, abandoned minutes and moved to seconds. The reason is his things that are not discussed anywhere near as much as they should. His dismantling of the remnants of the arms control regime, which has offered some degree of protection against the substantial growing threat of nuclear war. All that's left is the New START Treaty, which is probably too late to renegotiate. But the worst thing is his almost fanatic dedication to maximizing the use of fossil fuels and to eliminating the regulatory system that somewhat mitigates the effect. We're facing to a very serious crisis, and there's not a lot of time to deal with it. Taking 4 years to race towards the abyss causes severe problems. And fortunately, we're saved another 4 years of it, maybe. But that was the prime issue in the election from my point of view. He's also devastated the formal American political system. There was plenty of problems before, but he's essentially purged the executive of any independent critical voice. It's a collection of sycophants. I mean, he hasn't bothered to make appointments to the administrative offices, which have to be ratified by the Senate. He just makes temporary appointments who are his own guys. And in step after step, he's been systematically undermining the formal structure of the political system, which is a serious problem. But it's much deeper than Trump. Quite apart from Trump, the U.S. is facing a serious constitutional crisis and has been for some time. He's made it much worse. But nothing compares, and then there's plenty of crimes we can mention, but unfortunately they're not unique to the Trump administration. But the worst ones of all are those that I mentioned. His position on global warming may seriously damage, might even doom organized human life on Earth. It's no small thing.
So with 270,000 coronavirus deaths in the United States, are you astonished that 74 million people voted for this man?
That
Are you astonished that 74 million people voted for this man?
The very fact that he was able to run for office is a remarkable victory for Trump. It's astonishing that someone who had just killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans could be considered a viable candidate, and in fact could increase his voting, the total voting since 2016. It's as if it didn't matter. This tells you a lot about the state of the country, as does the fact that over 3/4 of Americans, of Republicans, think he won the election. It's a very serious situation. In fact, the election was a disaster for the Democrats all across the board. They managed to get rid of Trump, but it was mostly dislike of Trump in relatively affluent suburban areas, probably swung it. But everywhere else, Congress, legislation, state legislatures, local officials, almost everywhere else, the Democrats lost. It's an unbelievable defeat under a situation where you'd think they could have just swept the election. And that's very serious, not just for the United States, but for the world. The U.S. does have extraordinary power. What happens in the United States has an enormous effect on the world.
Okay, so in January of next year, we're going to see a Biden presidency. How progressive is Biden, do you think? Do you think he's an Obama continuity candidate, or do you think he can be pushed by the left into more progressive policy directions?
He can be pushed by the left, and Obama could have been. The great tragedy of the Obama administration is that his pleasant rhetoric was taken seriously. So when he was elected, the activist segment of the population said, let's trust him and we won't do anything. Okay. He was a Clintonite, neoliberal, kind of Blairite, New Labor type. So he drifted to the right. And within 2 years had so totally betrayed his popular constituency that they voted Republican in the midterm elections, and for very good reasons. Even union voters said this guy's just betrayed us, which he did. Now, if that's done with Biden, it'll be the same thing. But he can be pushed a little bit towards the progressive side, which is not very progressive, remember. What's called radical in the United States is called conservative in most other countries. So just take Bernie Sanders. Actually, one of the chief correspondents of the Financial Times, Rana Foroohar, good correspondent, just in a column made a kind of a quip, which isn't too far off the mark. She said if Sanders was running in Germany, he could run as a Christian Democrat. And if you take a look at his programs, you can see what she meant. The top two programs, which he kept emphasizing over and over, are universal health care and free higher education. Yeah, you could run in Germany as a Christian Democrat on that. In fact, it's hard to think of a country that doesn't have universal health care. And most countries, poor and rich, have free higher education. But that's considered too radical for Americans, way out on the fringe. It's a strange country in many ways. And so, yes, there is a kind of a social democratic progressive segment, and they have somewhat influenced Biden. If you look at his appointments, they're slightly more progressive on average than Obama's. Not a lot, but somewhat. And on some issues like labor rights and the economy, not too bad. Others more or less mainstream Clintonite Democrat. But I think he's susceptible to pressure. The question is whether it'll come. case of Obama, it didn't come.
So if we look at the pandemic from when it emerged in the West from March onwards, there was a report by the Global Health Security Index in October of 2018, which said that the UK and the US on paper were the most prepared for a pandemic should it hit. When it hit in practice, of course, it was Vietnam, Singapore, and New Zealand who performed the best. Now, what do you see as being the reason for this British and American failure on the pandemic? Is it a crisis of neoliberalism? Is it exceptionalism from the British and American side? What's your take?
Well, first of all, let's go back a couple of years. In 2003, and it's worth doing that because we're facing pretty much the same situation that we did in 2003. And if we don't learn from what happened, it'll go the same way. 2003, the Sars epidemic was contained. Scientists pointed out that it's very likely that there'll be another serious coronavirus epidemic, maybe a pandemic. And they also laid out the means that were necessary to deal with it, to prepare to, so that you understand the nature of the viruses, you can quickly move to prevention, to vaccines if you need them. Everything will be set up for it if a new coronavirus appears. Well, what was done? Essentially nothing. One reason is just plain capitalist logic. Drug companies who have profits coming out of their ears, thanks to the mislabeled free trade agreements, basically investor rights agreements, which give pharmaceutical companies, others, enormous virtual monopoly pricing rights through extreme protectionist measures. So they're flush with money. They have wonderful labs, but you don't make profit on it. You don't make profit preparing for a disaster that might occur in 5 or 6 years. So they didn't do anything. That's straight capitalist logic. Then comes the neoliberal plague. The slogan was basically given by Reagan and Thatcher at the early days of the neoliberal assault. Government is the problem, not the solution. There's no society. Okay, so which means, translated into simple words, it means hand decisions over to private capital and take them away from institutions that have some responsiveness to the public. It's the core notion of neoliberalism. The other aspect, which was added right away by the economic guru of the movement, Milton Friedman, influential article in 1981, stated that corporations have a single responsibility to enrich themselves. They're given a gift by the public. Incorporation is a gift from the public, many advantages, but you don't have any responsibility to the public, just enrich yourself. So here's a set of principles, 1981. Hand decision-making over to private power, which is unaccountable to the public and has the sole goal of enriching itself. Well, not hard to guess what's going to happen. And we now have estimates of what did happen, if anybody didn't know the details. So, for example, the Rand Corporation, the main government-funded research institute in the United States, just came out with a study of the amount of wealth transferred from the working class and the middle class by their measure. That means the lowest 90% of the population. The wealth transferred from them to the very rich, not the top 10%, the top fraction of that during the neoliberal years, $47 trillion. And that's a serious underestimate. So Reagan and Thatcher both instantly did the obvious thing. If you're going to rob the public, destroy any means of protection. So their first acts were to decimate the labor unions, the one means by which people can organize to protect themselves. Had a big effect, major effect. In fact, a number of economists regard that as the major reason for the vast inequality that's happened. More than that, Reagan opened the spigot on means of robbery of the public. Prior to the Reagan administration, the tax havens and shell companies were illegal, and the Treasury Department enforced the law. Reagan said, no, all open. Capital has to be totally free to do whatever it wants. Well, tens of trillions of dollars stolen from the public in tax havens, not included in the RAND calculation. And Clinton comes along with international trade agreements designed to free capital to do whatever it wants with no constraints, and to put working people in competition with the lowest, most suppressed labor in the world. What do you think is going to happen? Well, many things happen which were quite predictable. All of this, you add all of this up, you get a tremendous blow against the general population. Meanwhile, some have made out fine, like the top 0.1%, 0.1, not 1, have increased their share of wealth from 10% to 20% since Reagan. Has plenty of effects. One of the effects is the coronavirus. The government has great labs, plenty of resources, but they couldn't pick up where private capital departed from the game because government is the problem. So essentially nobody did it. We're facing the same situation. This pandemic will sooner or later be overcome. Terrible cost, needless cost, as we know, because there are many countries that have handled it very well, not perfectly, but very successfully. Can run through them. It's quite a range, including poor countries in Africa, rich countries like New Zealand. China is apparently back to normal, very few cases. And countries like Vietnam, right on the border of China, virtually no cases, can be handled. Hasn't been by a number of countries, including UK and US. US is the worst in many respects. But there's more. But while it's true that the drug companies were out of the game, capitalist logic, government was out of the game, neoliberalism, there still were things you could do. So when Obama took office in January 2009, he did call the Presidential Scientific Advisory Council to prepare a pandemic response program. They came back with one, it was implemented. There were American scientists working with Chinese colleagues to identify potential lethal coronaviruses. So some things were done. That all ended on January 2017, when President Trump took office. First days in office, he dismantled the pandemic response system, started defunding the Center for Disease Control, continued every year in office, withdrew the programs of American scientists working with Chinese colleagues. Well, all that had effects. The US was singularly unprepared. And then comes a record, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which I don't have to review, which just caused total chaos. By now, the government has said, we're out of business. We can't do anything about this. I'll leave it to the states and the localities. So in the town where I live in Arizona, Tucson, there happens to be a Democratic mayor who's imposed a curfew. the Republican governor refuses to do it. When you impose a curfew, there's a burden on people. There's also a burden on the economy. That'll be blamed on the local liberals who've imposed this curfew. And that's the strategy. At the federal level, do nothing. Whatever's done at the state or local level, the negative consequences. Of course, it'll save plenty of lives, but there'll also be negative consequences. You can blame that on the liberals who are carrying out these authoritarian measures and taking away your freedom. It's a perfect terrain for right-wing demagogues. And I think we may very well see Trump and his associates roaring back by their success in making the country ungovernable for the next couple of years. The kind of guiding genius in this system is Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. He has a 10-year record of success in making the country ungovernable if the wrong people are in charge. So when Obama came in, he said very straight out, our task in the Senate is to make sure that nothing happens. Well, when Trump came in the Senate, then things started to happen. Legislation to enrich the super rich and empower the corporate sector. That's the whole legislative agenda. Plus staffing the judiciary top to bottom with young ultra-right lawyers who'll be there for a generation to block any mildly progressive initiatives, no matter what the public wants. So now that that Biden's back in and another Democrat, the strategy will be make the country ungovernable with the assistance of Trump, who probably will set up some kind of alternative, true government somewhere, dismissing this fake government that was elected by fraud, by manipulations of the deep state, which happens to be in the White House. That's a strategy that could work.
I'd like to ask you about the links between the pandemic and the ways we can tackle climate change. So there's essentially two takes you can adopt. So there was a Paul Krugman opinion piece in the New York Times in mid-November, which said, basically, if we can't deal with pandemics, we're not going to be able to deal with climate change. It's a much larger issue. But there's also an optimistic case. You could say in March and April, the number of flights, they dropped by 96%, and that wasn't politically possible only a year before. Do you think the pandemic makes radical change more likely?
It's not going to happen by itself. I mean, just notice what the effect had of the pandemic on the election. The effect on the election was to give a substantial victory to the perpetrators of the disaster. That has to sink in. That's what the country is. Now, I think the pandemic does give the post-pandemic period, when it comes, does give opportunities, but it's going to be hard work to do anything about it. Let's just take the most obvious. Part of the reason for the extremely severe effect of the pandemic on the United States is simply that we don't have a health system. There's no universal health system. Actually, to be precise, there is a universal health system in the United States. It's called emergency rooms. If you can drag yourself to an emergency room, by law, they'll take care of you, maybe even very good care. It's the most savage, cruel, expensive form of universal health care that exists. But that's the one we have. Now we have a government, a democratic administration, says we can't have universal health care. It's too radical. Most of the population wants it, but most of the population has wanted it from way back. You go back as far as the Reagan administration, about 70% of the population thought that universal health care ought to be an amendment to the Constitution, should be part of the general. And about 40% of the population thought it already is in the Constitution, meaning such an obviously good thing, it must be in the Holy Writ, you know. Well, there have been polls like that for a long time. They're always beaten back in very interesting ways. So I lived most of my life in Massachusetts, which is the most liberal state. Every couple of years, there would be a referendum proposal on universal health care for Massachusetts. At first, if you looked at the polls, very strong support. Then the propaganda campaign begins. The business world starts up major propaganda campaigns focused on the fact, and it is a fact, that if you have universal health care, your taxes are going to go up. Of course, the other side of that is, yes, your taxes will go up and your medical costs will go way down, far below the taxes. But that wasn't in the propaganda, just your taxes will go up. And an interesting measure of the level of functioning democracy in a country is what is the attitude towards taxes. It's a very interesting measure. If you had a really pure functioning democracy, the day when you pay your taxes will be a day of celebration. It's a day in which we've gotten together, we decided what we want, we've decided how to pay for it, now we're doing it. Let's go out and have a drink. That's a pure democracy. Suppose you have a pure totalitarian state, the other end of the spectrum. Then, of course, it's sheer robbery. This enemy, the government, is coming and stealing away your money. So, of course, you hate it. You can rank countries from the totalitarian mentality and social system to the democratic mentality and social system, in large part by attitudes towards things like taxes. The United States is way towards the totalitarian end. Taxes are those foreign agents robbing you of your money, so we don't want to pay taxes. I'd rather pay twice as much to the insurance companies. That's essentially the attitude. It's the United States is not unique in this respect, but it's towards one end of the spectrum among the formally democratic societies. Anyway, getting back to the referenda, this propaganda was effective enough so that it went along with other things. They're going to force you to go to a doctor you don't like, all sorts of other lies, usual propaganda. It always ended up after a couple of months that people were opposed to the universal health care. There's a lot of work to be done to try to get something as elementary as rising to the level of every other country. I mean, you can't think of a country that doesn't have some form of universal health care. But even rising to that level is much too much for the highly class conscious business classes in the United States, which are constantly fighting a bitter class war, relentless, and are very powerful. It's worth remembering that the business classes are basically Marxists, vulgar Marxists. They're always fighting class war. The values may be reversed, but they basically agree that history is a struggle of class war and we've got to win.
I want to ask you about the crisis of democracy that we're seeing across the world. So in Brazil, we've got a former army captain who's in charge, who has disregard for the democratic process. In India, there's now a law which dates back to 1967, in which the state can label and ban opposition groups as terrorists. In the United States, there's a president who won't accept the result. Do you think democracy across the world is facing an existential crisis?
There was a very serious crisis pre-Trump. Trump has made it considerably worse. As I mentioned, he's basically purged the executive branch of the government of anything but sycophants. There isn't an independent voice there. Goes much further. Congress years ago had installed inspectors general to monitor the performance of the executive branches for malfeasance, corruption, and so on. They started looking into the incredible swamp of corruption that Trump has created in Washington. He took care of that very quickly. He just fired them all. Okay, that's a tin pot dictatorship. It's not Hitler. It's not fascism. It's a standard tin pot dictatorship where they have a military coup every couple of years. He's tried to purge the top military, switch it around so that he has loyalists. It hasn't totally succeeded. He's the federal attorneys in the states, especially New York, Southern District of New York, that's Wall Street. They started looking into his corruption, fired them. The final step was saying he's not going to accept the election. Now, liberals are enjoying the spectacle of judges turning down these election challenges, sometimes ridiculing them. I think they're missing the point. I think it's a very clever strategy. It's a strategy that mobilizes his base, instills into them even more deeply the idea that the election was stolen, their savior was taken from them by the machinations of the liberals and the deep state, which even includes the judges. So they have even more support for him, even more adoration. I think it's just clever. You know, people are wondering, why does he keep pushing these impossible lawsuits? Smart move. He's building up his base that way. And you can see it showing up in the polls. Like I said, over 75% of Republicans now believe the election was stolen. These tactics are working. They're going to be a good technique for making the government, making the country ungovernable. Even take things like this unconscionable delay and simply handing over data about the pandemic to the incoming administration, which of course makes it much harder for them to carry out any sensible preparations. Well, that's going to cause more deaths, more suffering, unpopular lockdowns, which can be blamed on someone else, make the country in much worse shape. Very good idea. If Biden comes into office with a country with enormous problems, there'll be, no matter how competent they are, there'll be failures to deal with them. Blame them on the administration. Okay? Perfectly sensible strategy all the way across the line. And it could very well work. As I say, he has the Senate in his pocket and so on. Now, as for the constitutional crisis, that's much deeper, much deeper. Now, if you go back to the 18th century, the American Constitution was a step forward in many ways, very flawed, but by 18th century standards, kind of progressive. Even the phrase, "we the people," though it wasn't enacted, but even the phrase had a resonance. That's why the European leaders, King of England, the Tsar, Metternich, were terrified of the American Revolution. They thought it was going to bring this curse of republicanism, which would spread over the world and destroy authority and civilization. Domino theory, basically. King George III said that the whole British Empire might collapse if we can't contain this rot, you know. So it was kind of progressive by those standards. But this is not the 18th century. To adhere today to the decisions of a small group of very wealthy slave owners is a little bit anachronistic. And remember that the government was created so as to undermine democracy. That was very explicit. Not my view. The gold standard in scholarship, Michael Klarman's scholarly work on the Constitution, the main most respected work, is called The Framers' Coup, the coup of the framers against democracy. Madison, Hamilton, others thought democracy is a severe danger, and they designed the system so that it would be protected from this threat in many ways. One of them was to place most of the power in the Senate. The Senate was unelected until about 100 years ago. It was appointed. It's 6-year terms, so long time in office to be freed from any popular pressure. But much worse than that is the way it's apportioned. It's apportioned by states. So Wyoming, which has maybe 500,000 people, has 2 senators. California, 40 million people, 2 senators. I mean, if the United States were to try to enter the European Union with this political arrangement, I suspect it would be turned down by the European Court of Justice. And if you take a look beyond, this provides overwhelming power in governance to the rural areas. That also works for other reasons because of apportionment of representatives and so on. But that means overwhelming power in the hands of traditional white, less educated, conservative, white supremacist, evangelical, traditional sectors. That's overwhelming power in the Senate, obviously, in the House through redistricting and so on. Now, what that means is, if you take a look at the votes for the last couple of decades, the Democrats win the popular vote, they lose the electoral vote. The House of Representatives, the Senate, legislatures, mostly in the hands of Republicans, even with a large Democratic vote, like in this election, Biden won by about 6 million votes, but barely scraped through, almost by accident in a couple of counties. Tens of thousands of votes had gone in different directions. You'd have a different president. That's a constitutional crisis, and there's no way to deal with it. The only way to deal with it would be through amendments, but any amendments will be blocked by the conservative rural, not majority, but most powerful sector. So it's a real crisis. This was before Trump. Trump's exacerbated it.
I'd like to begin to integrate some of the questions that people have submitted, and we've had quite a few on conspiracy theories, which has been something that has been brought into sharp focus during the pandemic. And I was reading this morning that there was one poll that suggested that up to half of Americans would be unwilling to take a vaccine, and high-profile figures such as Elon Musk also saying that they would refuse to take the vaccine. Why do you think conspiracy theories have proliferated over the last few months, the last few years? Is it a social media thing, or is it a decline in trust in institutions?
Let's go back to the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, which set in motion a process by which the working class, much of the middle class, severely harmed for the benefit of the super rich. That has effects, not just in the United States and England. Pretty much similar things happen in the European Union with the extreme austerity measures finally ended, but pressed by German banks and the radically anti-democratic structure of the European Union, which puts most decision-making power in the hands of unelected bureaucrats. European Commission, unelected, IMF, European Central Bank, the famous Troika. That's where decisions are, with the big banks, mostly German banks, looking over their shoulders. So they impose very harsh austerity measures, undermined the economy, undermined the poor, kind of similar to what happened in the United States and England under both the Tory government and the New Labour government. Well, that has effects, not just economic effects, has social and cultural effects. Means a huge number of people are angry, disillusioned, resentful for good reasons, have contempt for institutions. It's gone way down. Like in Europe, the traditional governing parties, center left, center right, have almost disappeared. Socialist Party, Social Democratic Party in Germany goes back to the 19th century. There's nothing left of it. It's talk about what happened in England. There was an effort to create a genuine political party, Labour Party, that would be participatory and work in the interests of its constituents and the country. A lot of popular support. Programs very popular. 2017 election was huge victory for Labour. The whole British establishment, left to right, the media, Parliamentary Labour Party, went into action to destroy it in a vulgar, disgraceful fashion, to try to kill Corbyn and any of his efforts. We're not going to tolerate any of that stuff. Something milder, but sort of similar, happened with Sanders in the United States, not to the extreme level of Britain, but similar. We're not going to allow that. Okay, no. This means that, and the betrayal goes beyond that. Let's take Obama again. Obama came in 2009 with lots of support from labor, from the poor, from the left, and so on. He's this wonderful guy with his beautiful rhetoric. He came in when there was the housing crisis. The housing market had collapsed. That led to a financial crisis. Under Bush, Congress had passed legislation, TARP legislation, to do something to deal with the huge financial crisis, which actually threatened to break down the whole world economy for a while. The legislation had two parts. One part was to pay off the perpetrators of the crisis, the banks whose criminal activities, predatory lending practices, prime mortgages, complex financial instruments to hide what was going on, thanks to Clinton. Those were the perpetrators. So we have to pay them off. They were funded lavishly. There was another part of the legislation. Do something about the victims, the people who lost their homes under foreclosures, who lost their jobs, whose lives were destroyed. Do something for them. Guess which part of the legislation was implemented? Obama had the Senate and the House in his hands. Well, I don't have to tell you. One was implemented, the other was dismissed, in fact, ridiculed. People may not have known the details, but they could see what was happening. By 2010, midterm election, you could see it in Massachusetts, liberal state. Ted Kennedy, the leading liberal, had died, had to be a replacement election. And a Republican won. People were so angry at the betrayal that either they didn't vote or they voted Republican. Even union members didn't vote Democrat. They had been betrayed. And it continued for the rest of the Obama administration and Trump, obviously. So yes, people are angry, don't understand what happened to them, looking for somebody to blame. Can't be my fault. You don't blame the corporate sector because they're hidden behind a veil of propaganda. So, it's China who's stealing our jobs. It's not the it's not the bankers in New York and Chicago who say we can make more money if we send work to China. They're not stealing our jobs. It's China stealing our jobs. You have a good propaganda system, you can get away with these things. So getting back to your question, when people feel that something is happening to them that's destroying their lives, you can't get by from paycheck to paycheck, nothing in reserve. It's not my fault. I'm working hard. Somebody else must be doing it. Okay, let's blame, let's join QAnon, blame the deep state, blame somebody, the Jews, the immigrants, whoever it may be. In fact, if you take a close look at Trump's voters, as has been done, Trump's major support is not working class. The major support is in the income range of 100,000 to 200,000. That's about twice the median wage. Okay, that's the base of support. And if you look there more closely, or if you go to the parts of the working class that voted for Trump, they're relatively affluent, meaning above the median wage. But they divide into those, they're all angry and resentful. There are some who blame immigrants. There are some who blame someone else. The ones who blame immigrants are the ones who overwhelmingly voted for Trump. It's a pretty sharp divide. So yes, you're looking for someone to blame. Okay, you have the same thing in England. We'll blame the Polish workers. They're taking our jobs away. Let's get out of the European Union. Yes, you're going to look for something. And I think that's a major factor in the rise of conspiracy theories, just as it's a major factor in the rise of extremist religious cults. Like the United States happens to be an unusually religious society from way back, hundreds of years. But you take a look now, about 80% of the population believe in miracles. Almost half the population believes that the second coming is imminent, maybe in our lifetimes. People are grasping for straws to try to explain what's happening to them. What's actually happening to them is concealed behind a veil of illusion, propaganda, distortion, and so on. Now, if an activist left should be doing to lift that veil, that's what they should be working on. You can see it very specifically. It's very interesting to look at individual cases closely. So take the election again. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact about what happened in South Texas on the Texas border. It's mostly a Mexican-American community. It hadn't voted for Republicans for 100 years since Harding. Solid Democrat. This year switched towards Trump. Some counties he actually won. In others he gained substantially. What happened? Well, number of things. One thing that happened is what's called Biden's great gaffe. He made a terrible error, which he was condemned for by the liberal press. How could he dare to do this? In the last presidential debate, at the very end, he said something moderate about how we have to try to save human society from destruction. Those were not his words. His words were, we have to face the fact that we have to move away from an oil-based economy, which happens to mean the same thing. We don't do that, we're toast, we're finished. So he did say that at the end of the debate. People are appalled. How could he say something so outrageous and stupid? Well, that's now blamed for the switch in votes at the South Texas border is an oil-based economy. So local people, mostly Hispanic, were saying, this guy Biden that wants to take away our jobs and destroy our communities, all and our businesses, all because some liberal somewhere say that there's this global warming happening someday, and we're not going to vote for that guy. Well, if the Democratic Party were a popular party which cared about people, they, like Corbyn was trying to create in England, if they were a party like that, they would have had people organizing down there, trying to explain what in fact is true. What is true is, first of all, we have to move from an oil-based economy or we're finished. That happens to be true. The people in South Texas will suffer from it. Their children will. You can't get away with it. It's like saying, I don't like this hurricane, I'll legislate it out of existence. So that's the first thing. Second thing is to tell them what also happens to be true. If we move to a sustainable energy economy, you're going to have more jobs, a better lifestyle, a better place to live. And here's the reasons. That's what activist organizing is. Family by family, neighborhood by neighborhood, that's what you do. And then actually in places where it was done, Latino organizing had taken place without any help from the Democratic Party, of course. But in Arizona, where I live, there had been Latino-based organizing. It worked. South Texas, nothing. So they voted for Republicans for the first time in 100 years. Well, there's other factors, but that's a major one. And that tells you a lot. The Labor Party here could learn the same lesson. There wasn't much organizing in the traditional labor areas. They're in our pocket. We don't have to worry about that. Has effects, lethal effects, in fact.
So I'm really conscious of your time, so I'll go for a couple more. We've had a question about what do you think the responsibility of intellectuals is today?
Same as it always was. Same as it's been since Socrates, if you want an example. They should be corrupting the youth by asking too many questions. And in fact, we remember that there was a reaction to that. Well, you look at the history of, the term intellectual is a recent one, but there have been people who are essentially what we call intellectuals throughout history. They weren't well treated. Socrates had to drink the hemlock, corrupting the youth of Athens. Can't allow that. Roughly at the same time of history, according to our lore. How accurate it is, you could question, but according to the lore, there were people who were called prophets, who were in, 5-6 centuries BC in Palestine. How were they treated? Who were they, first of all? Well, it's a mixture, but mainly they were people who were condemning the acts of the evil kings, giving geopolitical analysis, saying, you're leading us to catastrophe, calling for mercy for widows and orphans, and all kind of stuff like that. Now, that was one group. There was another group who 5 centuries later were called false prophets, the flatterers at the court. How are the two groups treated? First group was imprisoned, driven into the desert, demonized. The first use of the famous phrase, Jewish self-hatred, comes from that period. The kind that's used to demonize Jewish critics of Israel today, was used by King Ahab, the epitome of evil in the Bible, called the prophet Elijah to him and denounced him because he's a hater of Israel. He's condemning the acts of the evil king. So he's a Ocher Yisrael in Hebrew. It's translated as hater of Israel. How can you dare to criticize the acts of the king? Well, let's go to the modern period. It goes all the way through. The term intellectual got its modern usage right at the time of the Dreyfus trial. How the Dreyfusards today are honored. How are they treated at the time? Bitterly condemned. Émile Zola had to flee the country to escape imprisonment. The immortals of the Académie Française, the great heroes, bitterly condemned these writers and artists who are daring to criticize our wonderful institutions, the state, the army, and so on. Well, that's the treatment of dissident intellectuals pretty much throughout history. So what's their responsibility? To be the kind of people who get condemned because they're doing the right thing.
Okay, I think I'll finish with this one, which is a sort of a combination of some of the questions that we've had, and it's about activism. What advice would you have for students, anyone really, who cares about the future of the planet and wants to use activism to bring about positive change?
I mean, this generation, your generation, is in an astonishing situation. It's the first time in history that a generation, yours, has to make a decision as to whether organized human life is going to persist on Earth. It has to be made by your generation, one way or the other. You have no choice. Either you say, we're going to commit ourselves to maximize the probability that decent human society can survive, even be improved, or else we're going to say, let it go down the tube. There's no other choices. That's an incredible challenge, incredible responsibility. It's never happened before in history. It'll never happen again, because either you'll make the decision that history continues, in which case it won't have to be faced, or you'll make the decision that said the game's over, in which of course it won't be faced. It's a pretty serious responsibility. Never happened before, will never happen again. It's in the hands of people like you. It's, as Greta Thunberg said, it's the betrayal of the older generation. It is a betrayal, horrendous betrayal, but you're left with the results.
Are you optimistic? Are you optimistic for the future?
It's for you to say. I mean, there are optimistic signs. Things like Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement in the United States, the global strike, lots of good things happening. Will it be enough? Can't tell. That's a matter of will and choice, which are unpredictable.
Okay, that's a stark warning to finish on. Noam, I just want to say thanks very much for giving your time. It was really excellent to talk to you. I know how pressed your schedule is, so it's great that you've given the time to talk with King's Politics today. And I wish you all the best for the future, and I hope you enjoy your 92nd birthday next week.
Thank you very much. Good to talk to you.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone. Yep.